Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world, and welcome once again to the penultimate session of Day 2, Week 4 of the 2020 FIPP Congress and Digital Innovators Summit. We've had some more fantastic sessions this week, and this now is the 55th session of this year's event, and it's a very special one indeed. In the time that I've been at FIPP, our work has only been possible with the support of a couple of key partner organisations who've been unwavering in their support of the organisation and of our industry. And I'm delighted to welcome one of these, PressReader, to the Congress today. They're also, of course, a key strategic sponsor of this year's event. Many of you watching today are already partners of PressReader, but if you're not, and why not, let me tell you a little bit more about them. PressReader describe themselves as being on a mission to improve the way people discover stories that matter. PressReader's all-you-can-read service contains thousands of the world's leading newspapers and magazines and is enjoyed by millions of consumers every year. They partner with a range of large organizations to provide this service to their consumers as well. And now a key element of PressReader's vision is the creation of a sustainable future, and that is the subject of our session today. As ever, we encourage you please to ask questions, which you can do via the event portal or in Zoom, and we will address these at the end of the presentation. So it's now time to introduce my guest for today. It feels a little strange to be introducing him remotely from Canada, where he's based, as we're so used to having him live and in person at our events. He is, of course, the CEO International and Chief Content Officer for PressReader, Nikolay Malyarov. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks very much, James, for the introduction and for a description of what we do at PressReader. We certainly take pride in what we do, and I'll tell you a bit more about it and how we can make our world much more sustainable for generations to come.
Fantastic. I hope I didn't spoil your thunder too much with that.
No, not at all. But that's the beauty of live TV, live events, isn't it?
It's live. It is live TV, really.
Live TV.
Don't pretend it's an event. It's live TV. It's just because I love being on TV. Anyway, you've prepared a fantastic presentation for us, which I've read already about sustainability and PressReader's role in that. So why don't you take us through your story?
Sounds good. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you all, even if it's only virtually, because it reminds me of how committed we are to the future of our industry and to those who desperately need access to quality, trusted content. Today, I'm going to talk about sustainable development in publishing and why the coronavirus pandemic can't be an excuse to suspend our sustainability commitments and responsibilities. It should be, in fact, an incentive to double down on them. Virtual events provide an opportunity for more people to join in. And although PressReader requires no introduction, and James has just given one, I'm sure there are those in the audience who are not at all familiar with what we do. So before we dive deeper into the subject, and let me tell you very briefly a bit more about us. PressReader is a tech company that connects people to the world's best magazines and newspaper content any way they want to get it. And in addition to growing subscriber revenue directly from readers, we partner with tens of thousands of consumer brands who sponsor access to great content like yours on behalf of your readers, from hotels to airlines to cruise ships to libraries and hospitals, basically everywhere we are as individuals, as people. In a world where the majority of people are still unwilling to pay for digital news, that's actually a powerful business model, because it closes the loop on how we monetize content and more. We're not just a tech company, though. We're also a publisher of a magazine called The Insider. Now, I'd like to think that The Insider is a unique publication because as a company, we sit at the cross-section between consumers, publishers, and consumer-facing brands. And to capitalize on where we are in publishing, The Insider, we dig deep into issues that keep media and business executives awake at night, like retention, monetization, personalization, engagement, and experience. As a member of the FIPP board, I'm delighted that the Insider magazine, along with all of the content on PressReader, is completely free for FIPP members. If you're not yet a member of this great organization, it's certainly time to join. Now, our most recent issue of the Insider, which we just released in July, is all about sustainable development. When we started working on it, we lived in a very different world. It goes back to January. We began creating content about sustainability before COVID-19 became top of mind. But when the global pandemic hit, overnight, our lives and our companies changed in ways we never imagined. Although it was a shock to our lives, businesses, and markets, COVID-19, like crises before it, allowed us, or rather forced us, to think outside the box and change the way we live and the way we do business. It also reminded us that it's important to remember that sustainability is so much more than just being green. The United Nations actually set out 17 different sustainable development goals, and they feature everything from eliminating poverty and hunger in the world to reducing inequalities and building peace and social justice through strong institutions. For those who are not familiar with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the roots go back to 1987, when the World Commission on Environment and Development was formed and was led by the first female Prime Minister of Norway, Dr. Brundtland. They published a report, which was called Our Common Future, also known as the Brundtland Report. In it, the Commission defined sustainable development as, quote, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, end quote. A year after the report was released, John Elkington, a world authority on corporate responsibility, published his book, The Green Consumer Guide. The book sold millions. It was heralded as the catalyst for the modern day sustainability movement and was credited with starting the green consumer movement in America, the UK, and many other countries. It has been suggested that because of the recommendations in the Brundtland Report and the success of Elkington's Green Consumer Guide, it led to sustainable being perceived as green by consumers and business people. A decade later, Elkington published another book called Cannibals with Forks, in which he advocated that all businesses can and must help society to achieve three goals: economic prosperity, environmental protection, and social equity. He coined these goals as the triple bottom line of profit, people, and planet, which has become a business sustainability framework adopted by thousands of organizations worldwide. His latest book, released earlier this year, called Green Swans, The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism, explores the face of capitalism, democracy, and sustainability and its impacts on business, society, and the planet. Writing this book had Elkington rethinking his triple bottom line framework from profit, people, and planet to people, planet, and prosperity. This was an important change because prosperity is really the end game for everyone, every business, and every living thing on planet Earth. The Insider magazine is full of case studies of what many businesses and sectors are, and it's entirely free on our website and the PressReader app. It also includes spotlights on two of our publishing partners, Prisa from Spain and Hearst from the US. I really hope you'll check them out. Both publishers have made the Sustainable Development Goals part of the DNA of their mission, values, and corporate culture. I truly found them inspiring. Few would argue that our planet needs help, lots of help, but it's not alone. People need help. Creatures on land, in the skies, and below our waters need help, and our institutions and economy need help. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions by printing with recycled paper and using eco-friendly ink is good, but it's just not good enough. But how do we apply sustainable development to the publishing industry? I can't address all 17 SDGs in my time today, so please read the Insider magazine to see what others are doing. Today, I'm going to focus on just one SDG that should resonate with all of us who advocate for quality journalism, democracy, and media literacy. It's SDG 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions. That covers a lot of territory, so I'm going to focus on just three: journalism, democracy, and media literacy. Let's start with journalism. Assuming, as we all do, that quality content deserves compensation, what is the mission of journalism today? Should journalism be only for the elite and those who are able and willing to pay for it? Is it to make money for shareholders? Or is it to inform and educate the masses and serve everyone equally, regardless of their ability or willingness to pay, with the rich, the poor, and even those who believe that digital content should be free? According to the American Press Institute, journalism's mission is to give citizens the information they need to make the best possible decision about their lives, their communities, their societies, and their governments. The News Media Association in the UK says that journalism plays a vital role in the democratic society and is a powerful source for good, something I think we can all agree on, right? Thomas Carlyle called in the Fourth Estate in 1841, a label that still lives on almost 200 years later and distinct from non-string media outlets that form the Fifth Estate. Get a little personal for a second. I grew up in a country where the media was heavily censored. There was no choice. There was no democracy. But during my formative years, I was fortunate to live in a country where I had a choice of content, and it shaped me and my view of the world around me. I was studying political science and law in the university at the time, which required me to read and critically analyze information. I was part of a generation that knew how to access primary sources outside the internet, which wasn't accepted as a primary source at that time. But in what felt like a blink of an eye, the internet has become the source. Since then, the world has been dramatically changing, and not necessarily for the better. Press freedom and democratic access to quality, trusted journalism is deteriorating. This is an alarming picture. We can deal with viruses, we'll find vaccines, but how are we going to deal with this? CNN's Brian Stelter once said, quote, "Democracy demands media literacy," unquote. And I couldn't agree more. In 2019, the Democracy Index, measured by the Economist Intelligence Unit, registered its lowest score in its history. And sadly, media literacy is on the same trajectory. You probably all remember back in 2016 when Stanford University reported that the majority of US students were not able to distinguish credible from unreliable news articles. 2 years later, only 2% of young people in the UK had the literacy skills to tell if a news story was real or fake. And in 2019, Stanford closed its latest media literacy study with a dire warning. If we don't act with urgency, our students' ability to engage in civic life will be the casualty. If ever there was a need for libraries and mainstream media to join forces to fight the good fight for media literacy, it is now. And here is why. In the past, local and some national media were the only news game in town. Those sources were held accountable to the tenets of journalism, and more often than not, they were trusted. They were powerful pillars of society. But now that has all been disrupted. In the US, local media is undergoing massive consolidation, leaving many people worried about the fairness of news coverage. Since 2004, the US lost over 2,100 newspapers, leaving thousands of American counties without a meaningful source of local reporting. And that pace of closures is accelerating. Now, this is just 16 years. Meanwhile, those who should be accountable in government and society live outside the media ecosystem entirely, reaching billions of people with whatever lies and propaganda they want to spread through social media and other digital channels. I've spoken before about how the power pyramid became inverted when the internet allowed us to own our own communications on a massive and global scale. But despite all of our power, we can't control the corruption that permeates the web in terms of false narratives, misinformation, and fear-mongering. And the costs of that are staggering. Close to $78 billion each year is lost due to fake news or false narratives. Thanks to all that false narratives infiltrating our lives, the foundation upon which mainstream media was built is crumbling. People are trusting media less and unsubscribing to it more. Let's not be fooled by subscriptions to our paywalls, because in the grand scheme of things, Those numbers may have an impact on your bottom line as you remove some hard costs and move people to products that are cheaper to produce and distribute. But the numbers are too small with respect to the overall population that your quality, trusted content must reach. Hey, but all is not lost. What we're seeing are two different trust realities at work. One shared by the wealthier, more educated, and frequent consumers of news, and the other by the mass population. These opposing trust realities are what's impacting the perception of journalism today. But as we all know, perception is often reality in most people's minds. The good news is that traditional media is still at the top of the trust barometer along with search. So if we can give the masses the tools and trusted information that helps them separate truth from falsehoods so they can make informed decisions about their role in society, we not only increase their media literacy, we further help elevate trust in traditional media back to where it used to be, above everything else. And the place to find the masses is, drum roll please, libraries. During my post-secondary school years, I was a reference librarian at the university as a student. That experience made me a passionate advocate for libraries ever since. At that time, students were required to subscribe to specific newspapers and magazines not available for free in the library. Mine was the New York Times. Normally, I couldn't have afforded, but we were given student discounts and the price was pretty negligible. Just enough to count the issues as paid circulation, I would guess. So even back then, the concept of democratizing access to content wasn't new to the publishing industry. Many media companies offer discounted rates to select audiences, and some still do. But discounting content for a select few isn't enough. It's not enough to solve the world's media literacy problem. In the 1900s, Andrew Carnegie called free public libraries the cradle of democracy. And many decades later, US President Roosevelt said libraries are essential to the functioning of a democratic society. The International Federation of Library Association said that a library's purpose is to give everyone the opportunity to learn, grow, and develop. And it explicitly includes people neglected by economic logic. So, if journalism's role is to be the fourth estate in a democratic society, and libraries are equally essential to the functioning of a democratic society, shouldn't media and libraries work together to achieve the same goal? The freedom of the press and uncensored access to media that matters. We need a concerted effort focused on the problem. And today, libraries are the ones leading the charge. They not only pay publishers to democratize access to content, they educate people of all ages and help their patrons determine what information they can trust and what they can't. So how many patrons are we actually talking about? Today, there are 1.1 billion registered users in libraries worldwide. But despite that, some people, like this professor, think they should be replaced by Amazon. That's just plain wrong. The public backlash to this article was so strong that Forbes, who published it in 2018, took it down and apologized to readers. Thankfully, there are far more people who believe otherwise, like the late Professor John Bing. To quote him, "To ask why we need libraries at all, when there is so much information available elsewhere, is about as sensible as asking if roadmaps are necessary now that there are so very many roads." In the US alone, 17,000 public libraries were visited more than 1.3 billion times last year, which is 10 times more than the number of people who attended these sports events combined. Globally, it's a similar story, with over 1 billion people in 2019 visiting libraries more than 6 billion times to borrow 9 billion physical documents and 13 billion digital resources that patrons could access from home. Now, there are only 381,000 libraries around the world with internet access, and millions of patrons who desperately need digital access to quality journalism. And despite librarians' growing concerns about the ever-tightening budgets and the escalating costs of resources patrons need, they believe so strongly that the democratic society can't be built on communities afflicted with media illiteracy that they're willing to pay for your journalism on behalf of those who cannot or won't pay for it. Last year at PressReader, we saw over 23 million library patrons read over 1 billion articles from nearly 17 million newspaper and magazine issues. Content publishers were paid for by libraries. When COVID hit, libraries in lockdown couldn't provide people the services and branches anymore. But they were able to support their need for newspapers and magazines with our remote access technology. And usage has skyrocketed. It was fascinating to see what people were reading and how that changed over the course of the pandemic. Now, I know that a lot of you have concerns, and let me address a couple of them. If I open my content to libraries, it will cannibalize my existing revenue streams. It's concern number one, and I hear you. But the truth is that the majority of library patrons will never pay for your digital content. They're not and never will be your target market for generating subscription revenue. The second concern I hear a lot is that your content will diminish in perceived value because it is assumed to be free. It's like the old saying, why pay for the cow when the milk's free, right? In fact, the opposite is true. Over 1 billion people have joined libraries specifically because they value the content and services offered. And patrons know that library resources are not free. The libraries pay for them through people's taxes. Sure, it's a great deal for users, but it's not a free ride. And as Libraries Ireland staff enjoy saying, libraries don't recycle, libraries reuse. So let's dig into publishers' concerns a bit more. How many people actually pay for digital news themselves today? According to Reuters' 2020 Digital News Report, roughly 13% of the planet on average are willing to pay for digital news. 87% are not. So how likely is it that the majority of library patrons are in the don't pay category? I would guess very likely. Reuters also tells us that only 28% of people prefer to access news directly. The remaining 72% prefer to get their news from search engines, social media, mobile alerts, aggregators, and email. Now, I think it's safe to assume that the 13% who are willing to pay also prefer direct access. This leaves 15% of people preferring direct access, but still not willing or able to pay for it. So who's willing to pay on behalf of that 15%? I'll let you think about that one for a bit. Yes, libraries. As guardians of the world's greatest treasures and arguably their communities, libraries have proven themselves to be an essential service to their patrons and society. They have the power to change the world, but the battles they face fulfilling their mission to democratize access to content is daunting. This was especially true during the pandemic, when some magazine media was classified as non-essential by governments in parts of the world. For instance, New Zealand and its library patrons were hit hard by this. Let me show you what we've seen on our end. What you're looking at is content consumed in select local markets. Now, we've taken a look at New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the US, and the UK. By local market, I mean content both produced and consumed on PressReader in the same country. Now, I appreciate that it's a little bit difficult to read, so let me clarify. The chart starts out from January the 1st and goes through the 15th of June on a horizontal scale. The top line is the UK data, followed by Australia, then by the US, Canada, and finally New Zealand. The absolute numbers are not what's interesting. It's the trends, particularly the big spikes happening around the end of March, beginning of April. Now, as you all remember, this was the time when a lot of these areas were going into various stages of lockdown. We saw spikes in Australia, the US, UK, and Canada, but New Zealand consumption stayed relatively flat. Not because of lack of interest in reading more, but because the availability of content produced in New Zealand was limited by the government's decision to classify non-news magazines as non-essential. Many magazine publishers shuttered their operations, or like Bauer at the time, closed them permanently. On a more global level, we saw subscriptions rise as more people started reading from home. The average sessions from our end nearly doubled when the pandemic hit us, a true testament that quality, trusted content was more important and more desired than ever. What was also notable was that more magazines were consumed since the self-isolation took effect, and content choices changed as well. What we saw trending in January and what we saw 4 or 5 months later were miles apart. Again, looking at the global level and the intersection of interest between New Zealand and overseas readers, the next 2 slides show top read categories in New Zealand from New Zealand publications and in New Zealand from global publications, comparing January and May. There are similarities between the two. I would note, however, that health conditions came in dead last in January for New Zealand readers reading the New Zealand sources and rose up in May. I mention this category because that interest in health conditions increased massively in New Zealand just 4 months later, as you would expect. And although it didn't make it to the top 5, the category experienced the highest growth, especially coupled with health as the category overall. You'll note a disproportionately higher increase in these 2 categories in New Zealand from overseas publications, however. That's the column on the right. Then, of course, comes the question about whether magazines were, in fact, an essential service during the pandemic. Different jurisdictions approached this differently. And even in Canada, there were provinces which treated all type of content as essential, British Columbia being one of them. Others only applied this label to newspapers and news gathering organizations, for instance, TV and radio, and were silent on the magazine side. In New Zealand, remember, certain types of magazines were excluded from being considered to be an essential service entirely. Anecdotally, data showed that readers were looking for not only trusted quality content that informed them beyond the news bites and summaries of various press conferences, but content that entertained them and provided a means of escapism. Now, if you take a look at this table, we've highlighted Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US again, the same markets that we looked at before. This slide shows you the top topics read by country, looking at magazines only, so not looking at newspapers, in May of this year. The top 5 categories in these 4 markets were pretty similar. Now, take a look at New Zealand. Look how different the content palette was. And it wasn't because the Kiwis were somehow disinterested in lighter content. No, it's just that content produced in the country had significantly diminished, at least as far as the availability of that content on PressReader was concerned. It goes without saying that we've provided this information to New Zealand MPA, so together with publishers' own data, they can use it to lobby the government for a different set of rules to be applied if another prolonged lockdown were to happen. Hopefully it doesn't. But I would suggest that this data has more far-reaching conclusions. I wanted to quickly show you how we used a behavioral analytics product, Native AI, that analyzes millions of different touch points to dive deep into what content was being consumed by readers. Take a look at the health-related content. Looking at the same day in January, same period in January and same period in March. In January, people read 4 times fewer articles about health on PressReader then towards the end of March. But again, although the growth was impressive, it's not just about that. What's more interesting, please take a look at all the aspects of health-related matters they were diving into, including infectious diseases and mental health issues. It's not a coincidence. And we're now seeing a broader conversation about the effects of lockdowns and working from homes and the pandemic overall. Helen Keller once said that alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. And we've witnessed that firsthand. COVID taught us a lot of things over the past 6 months, but the most important lesson we've learned is that goodwill is good business. Goodwill is not charity, and it's not a one-off gift. It's a seed that once planted and nurtured can grow into lasting relationships that bring prosperity to all involved. Many of our publishing partners have asked us to open up their content for free during the pandemic, something our readers and we very much appreciate it. To continue on with examples of what we've done, one of our local partners in Canada, the Toronto Star, also asked us whether we'd be willing to forego our own fees we charge for running their branded edition service for schools. They wanted to give that service to pupils who are trying to learn at home at no charge. Of course, we've agreed. And back to libraries, all over the world, they proved once again their uncompromising commitment to serve their diverse communities. The old paradigm of them being guardians of books transformed them into being guardians of people, and I would argue democracy as well. Some turned their buildings into food banks and shelters, while others used their 3D printers to print face shields for frontline healthcare workers. They also heavily promoted our publishers' digital content to patrons stuck indoors with lots of time on their hands. This led to a massive increase in demand for publications on PressReader. One library in Jersey, the UK, reported that it increased by 259% in just 1 month. And they're not alone. We also saw many libraries creatively suggested digital content to help educate, entertain, and distract their communities from fears, frustrations, and mental health stresses of being isolated. There seems to be no end to what libraries and librarians are willing to do to keep their communities safe and sane. Journalism, democracy, and media literacy are essential institutions under the Sustainable Development Goal 16, and they're all under attack. And despite the valiant efforts of organizations such as the News Literacy Project and libraries around the world, media literacy, or the lack thereof, has reached a crisis point. If COVID-19 taught us anything, it's that putting our heads in the sand and thinking sustainable development is someone else's responsibility to make life on this planet better for all, that's a death sentence not just for us, but for everyone. Great leaders understand that a company's raison d'etre is all about people, not products and services. It's about compassion and giving back. Because we're not just another species living on planet Earth. We are humankind, and that makes us our brother's keeper, whether we choose that responsibility or not. We as an industry need to adopt more sustainable business practices, and we need to do it now. It really comes back to where we started, journalism's mission. Are we providing citizens with the information they need to make decisions in their lives and society? All citizens. Many publishers we work with are, and I hope after this presentation, you'll consider joining the good fight in helping libraries deliver the right content to the right people at the right time, through the right channels, at the right price. Know how I didn't say free? If you'd like to chat about this further, let's get on Zoom, Teams, Skype, or whatever platform you use. In the meantime, again, if you aren't already a FIPP member with free access to PressReader, I hope you'll consider joining. It's an amazing organization and it helps all of us. And then once you're there, download the Insider on PressReader and explore how publishers, libraries, and other businesses are investing in sustainable development, making it part of the DNA of their mission, values, and corporate culture. Thank you so very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nikolay. That was an incredibly wide-ranging and quite heartfelt presentation. I've got so many questions to ask you, I don't know where to start. I guess the first one, though, just tell us a little bit about the practicality of a library patron who goes to their local library. How do they then actually access the PressReader service and content?
It really depends on sort of what technical capabilities exist at a local library. A lot of libraries would have computers there because it's a place where people can go and access all types of media and platforms, and a lot of times it's people who can't afford a computer, frankly. So they would use the terminals that are available at the library. Some libraries, and this has become a paramount during the pandemic, also focus on providing remote access to various resources. Libraries have been shuttered during the lockdowns in many countries, and so being able to deliver the resources digitally has been incredibly important, and we can support that. So as a library patron, I'm sitting at home, logged down with the library card. I can authenticate myself that yes, I am indeed a member or patron of this specific library, and access PressReader as one of the other resources that are made available to me by the library. Now, the library pays for it, and this is important.
And that's crucial, isn't it? Because the library paying for it means that ultimately that money gets distributed back to the publishers and means that their content is still having some worth, which I think is a really crucial point that people don't always get. I'm wondering where to start. I think maybe the best place to start is the trends that you showed in terms of what happened during coronavirus with content consumption. Have the trends that you saw happening in March and April and May, have they continued? Have they continued beyond the initial kind of spikes? And do you think that that's leading to a permanent change in habit?
There has been a bit of flattening happening, as you've seen elsewhere. That initial bump, and a pretty obvious bump, as you've seen in the graphs that I've shown you, has leveled off. But it leveled off at a level that was different from January. It's much higher than that. That was in January. There was obviously a lot of kind of an impetus towards that's kind of drove people to seeking out quality information. That was very obvious, and this was observed in that spike in March and April. People were worried. People were looking for truth, and people were frankly scared of the information that they heard on radio and TV. So they needed somebody, and this is where the quality and trusted element comes in. They needed somebody to explain it for them in the language that they understand, from the publication that they really trust. What happened over the summer, obviously, the lockdown measures have been relaxed in many places. People were able to get back outside, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, enjoy the summer weather. And we saw that initial peak leveling off. However, the diversity of content, the diversity of interests, that has remained. We're still seeing pretty high interest in health-related matters, although it's pretty clear we're also getting tired of it, and that's natural. That's entirely understandable, and so people are looking for more of as a means of escapism. They need something else to focus on, and let somebody else worry about the pandemic and coming up with the effective vaccine for all of us to get vaccinated against this, right?
Amen to that. I mean, obviously, it's not a surprise that health and health conditions were top subjects, particularly in terms of growth, and you showed that in your graphs. Were there any kind of surprising results in there? Were there any kind of categories that you raised your eyes at and didn't think that they would become so popular? I'm thinking about some of the home interest categories and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that was one, and I think we can all relate. We went through our first sort of a few weeks of I'm on this organizational role about going through all the cupboards and wardrobes and taking out the stuff that you're doing the things that you're putting off for for months or years, as the case may be. So that was clear that you were looking for tips on how to organize things.
Nesting, Nick.
And certainly inspired by Marie Kondo's, I guess. Does it make me happy? And if it doesn't, take it out. But to me, I mean, these were the things that we can certainly find, relate to in real life. To me, the most interesting discovery at the time, and that underscored that element of escapism that we're providing. And it's because we aggregate so much content covering so many different topics, that need of escapism was very obvious, because you can shift from kind of a hard news to something that's a bit lighter, even sort of gossip and entertainment content that rolls even higher than it usually is.
Yeah.
What surprised me, although it shouldn't in the hindsight, was the interest in mental health issues. And as much as we're looking at the health category, and this is why I wanted to show you that deep dive into the health category overall, is that health is such a broad category, right? And we can see certain spikes in in infectious diseases, and that's very, very well understood even back then, that people were seeking content that dealt with infectious diseases. But the fact that people started flocking to content about mental health, that was very interesting, because it really early on it underscored that this is the issue, the consequence of this pandemic that we will continue to deal with even after we go through the peak of infections and build out that immunity, which I hope we will. The disruption to our lives and sort of the deeper, perhaps less noticeable effects of the pandemic, people were seeking out to it, and that's proof. We often talk about the stigma that's associated with mental health, and that's reducing because we're able to talk about it more openly. This is a cry for help.
Yeah.
People want to know more about it, and I would encourage publishing partners to perhaps focus more on it, and not just writing about it, but how to address it.
Absolutely, and it's a big issue in our industry as well. I think it's one that's not talked about enough, so it's something that people should definitely be thinking about. I mean, it makes sense that would be a category as well that people would be interested in. You talked in there about the library as being a sort of provider of service to patrons who perhaps otherwise are not able to access some of those services. How do we as an industry counter the ongoing government attacks that seem to happen around the world on libraries, which ironically are happening largely precisely because of the economic grounds that they're supposed to be mitigating? In other words, because they're not profit centers, they're seen as being merely a cost to society. How do we kind of counter that?
Well, to put it bluntly, if we're not supporting the libraries ourselves, we can't really blame the government for attacking the libraries and trying to cut costs in this sort of in the budgets by removing the expense from the libraries. If we're not looking at addressing head-on the media illiteracy, or what I often call is dumbing down of society, ourselves as publishers. And if we focus too much on building out our content strategy that only addresses the needs of the elite, who are able and willing to pay for content, then we can't really take a high road and blame the governments for doing what they're doing. I mean, at the end of the day, the governments are at the supposed to be at the service of the people, right? They supposed to be. That was the author's expression. But at the end of the day, they sit in their high offices and dole out the tax revenues. Now that tax revenue has seen a hit. This is where librarians have been strong. I mean, it's not the first time they're under attack. They've been through this in the 2008-2009 financial crisis as well. But they know how to reposition themselves, and I think the services that the libraries have provided during the pandemic, when they opened themselves up to being food shelters and sort of food banks and shelters for those afflicted by the pandemic who didn't have a place to stay, that used the resources, effectively public resources, to provide goods for the frontline healthcare workers. That's all an investment that libraries make it, where they claim a stake that, look, we're an essential part of us operating as a society, as mankind. So libraries and librarians in particular are quite resilient. But if we as publishers don't do our bit and don't address that that pretty bleak picture about where we are in terms of the democracy index, the free media, I'm sorry I don't want to sound like a fatalist, but we're doomed. Right. I mean, the two maps that I put side by side back from 2002 and 2020 are terrible to look at. But not all is lost, right? I mean, we can still turn the tide around.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never really thought of that dynamic that way. I mean, I guess the industry, the publishing industry in particular, particularly magazines, was built, well, newspapers, was built off the back of providing to mass audiences in terms of its economic wealth. And we've sort of lost sight of that a little bit because those mass audiences don't want to pay for content in quite the way we want them to. And the library can be a useful access point. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, and James, that's a very important point. I'm not coming out against the building out the direct consumer subscription revenue models.
Sure.
Those are absolutely essential to transformation of us as an industry towards a sustainable future for us. What I'm saying, and I've said this before, is that you can't rely on subscription revenue alone.
Yeah.
You have to diversify. Now, the diversification methods are changing. As much as a lot of publishers have invested into physical events, those are evolving into virtual events like this one. Yet to be seen how successful they are. Yes, they open up the event to larger audiences. Can you monetize them in the same way as before? Can you build out that kind of physical networking element of the event? That is yet to be seen. But what I'm going back to is that in terms of diversification of revenue sources, libraries, just as it is a direct subscription revenue, is just one of those pillars. There are more ways to skin the cat, as they say. So if you produce quality, trusted content that addresses the needs of the readers that you're trying to reach, you can get more revenue from more groups of readers, I guess, than just the readers who are prepared and willing to pay for the content directly to you. They will look for different ways of accessing content. I mean, look, not everybody, and going back to that willingness to pay for content, not everybody is willing to pay for content from just one publisher. We need to accept that. That certainly at the time when there was a monopoly on print distribution in a certain area, that was the, that was it. That was the modus operandi for most publishers. That has changed. You have a generation now that has grown up in a kind of a shared economy, in access to everything. Now, the good news is that they're willing to pay for it, but they're willing to pay for content that is aggregated, that is hyper-personalized, from platforms that really understand, my personal interests. They really dig deep into me and understand how to surface the content that is relevant to me as an individual in exchange for money that I'm willing to pay for it. The great news is that if that content is relevant, and if I trust that content, if it's quality content, then there is a monetary exchange that happens as a result, that the production of that content gets compensated for. But again, libraries are just one of those pillars in that ecosystem as well.
You mentioned just now in one of your answers about the slide that you showed about the deterioration of press freedom and the fact that was a kind of depressing thought, which it is, obviously. Do you think that's caused by the changing economics of the industry? Do you think that's primarily an economic squeeze that's happening, that's causing that deterioration of freedom? Because at first glance, it's quite hard to pin a particular there's no underlying obvious rationale why that should necessarily be the case over the last 20 odd years, which was the timescale you showed, other than the only thing I can think of is that in that time the economics of our industry have changed dramatically.
That was the biggest element that has affected the industry, where as an industry in some areas we haven't evolved or transformed, or whatever other verb that you want to put in there, quick enough to address our own economic models, our own P&L. If we, for years on, I remember I started working with PressReader 17 years ago, and I remember for the first several years working with publishers who were fearful of anything digital. Digital was going to cannibalize their print circulation models. In some cases, it was based purely on let's put it bluntly, ignorance. In other ways, it was based on personal stakes, where somebody's bonus depended on print circulation, on hitting certain targets. And there was not enough drive towards shoring up the transformation for what's yet to come. I do think that a lot of it was based on ignorance, not knowing what is yet to come, and not willing to hear about it and learn about it. So the end result is that we didn't come to where we are today fast enough. So we still carry the costs, the hard costs, the baggage, the legacy baggage that I often refer to, and that you can't, those costs are no longer sustainable. And what happened as a result is that you also lost the advertising revenue that supported the print production and print distribution. You also lost the readership that flocked elsewhere. So you start creating these news deserts that I've shown you, and where you have sometimes VC, sometimes another fund coming in, buying out a publishing organization, and them doing it purely from a P&L standpoint. If it doesn't fit into the Excel spreadsheet, they probably couldn't care less about the media literacy
or the impact on the
result of it, or the effects on democracy. Absolutely, all they care about is the shareholders' bottom line, and that's the scary bit here.
That is absolutely. I have a question from the audience relating to the initial, really the title of this, sustainability. What's your perspective on companies becoming B Corps? Is that something that publishers should aspire to? This is this certification that
B Corporation, B
I must admit I wasn't familiar with it until my wonderful moderator actually told me what it was. So I won't pretend.
And I have to say, look, when we started working on this issue, the sustainable development issue of the Insider, I have to say it was a massive learning exercise for me as well. I didn't realize how deep and how encompassing sustainable development was, and I've become quite passionate. I've interviewed a number of people. You can read the interviews in the magazine as well that talked about things. Look, I'll just give you an example, and I'll get back to the question in a sec. I interviewed a VP of Sustainable Development at MGM Resorts. So it's a massive hotel chain with massive properties, mostly in Las Vegas, that talked about providing, repurposing the leftover foods. And James, you and I have been to Vegas. We've seen how much food is being consumed and how much food is not being consumed there. Definitely. So repurposing some of the food scraps to feed the animals, to feed people, to feed the needy, and also to repurpose oyster shells for the production of more oysters. It's a fascinating story. Yeah, as I said, it was a teaching moment for me. That, working on this.
I'm glad all those oysters didn't go to waste, Nick.
Yeah, exactly. Read about it in the Insider. There is also a video that we've attached there, which we can do digitally, and you can see how the shells are being repurposed. Now, certification. Look, I think it's a decision that every corporation needs to take for themselves. Do they care about certification, or can they communicate the fact that they subscribe to sustainable development as part of their DNA for themselves? right? If you feel that consumers respond positively to you claiming that you're a certified B Corporation, by all means. I have to say that as a consumer, I pay attention to these things, just like I pay attention to what the hotels that I'm staying at, what they do in terms of their commitment to sustainability, and but I'm being cynical a bit. I look at what they say, and I'm trying to put it against what they actually do. And when I see an inconsistency between the two, I actually question their commitment to sustainable development. Or in some cases, I'll give a benefit of the doubt, and I'm like, well, they're still on that road towards being a sustainable development corporation. So perhaps having a third party certify you that you are actually committed to it might be a good thing, because you'll have somebody else looking at what you do at your practices and ticking the boxes, and then telling the people, yeah, I mean, these guys are actually doing what they said that they would. So.
We're nearly out of time, Nick. We've been talking for so long that we've almost run out of time for this session, but I've got a couple more questions I want to ask you. Firstly, I want to ask you, do you think that the publishing industry has done enough to be more sustainable? Do you think that we're one of the leading lights in this cause, or is there a lot more we can still do?
Look, I hate generalizing, right? I think it's wrong. There are some publishers who've done amazing things, and the couple of case studies that we've spotlighted in the Insider, Precy and Hearst, they've done really well. I don't think, as an industry, I don't think we talk loud enough about our commitments to sustainability.
No.
Because I would argue that the only thing that we really focused on was the things that I highlighted, is that commitment to using perhaps recycled paper, or removing plastic covers off of the magazines that are being mailed, and moving to more sustainable materials. And this was the point about this issue of the Insider. Being sustainable is more than just being green. And there's so many other things that we do as organizations that we don't even realize that we're doing these things, and they do fit within the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has set out. I think we can do better at communicating to our audiences that we are actually doing all of these things. And some are, but some can do better. We're not a bad industry.
That's certainly my mantra.
I know you're.
That's certainly my mantra as a trade association. We're not a bad industry.
We're not a bad industry, and we get a bad rap for doing things, and we're not talking enough about the good things that we're doing.
We do. Now, you've enabled me to plug very neatly the innovation book this year, which is of course sponsored partly by PressReader, where there is an entire chapter on sustainability and all the wonderful things that we've done in our industry on sustainability, of which there are some good examples in there. Nick, we're out of time, so I'm going to have to leave you there, but thank you so much for a fascinating and interesting presentation and discussion afterwards. Just remind everybody how they can get in touch with you if they need to. Publishing@pressreader.com.
Publishing@pressreader.com. You can go to pressreader.com. You can tweet at me at Malyarov, Malyarov. You can bug James and he'll connect me. Connect me to you. So many ways. And
just a reminder, of course, that all of you who are watching who are FIPP members get free PressReader membership, courtesy of Nikolay and his colleagues at PressReader. Many of you don't take advantage of this fantastic benefit, which enables you to keep abreast of everything that's happening in our industry in the world, because you'll be getting access basically to every publication in the world. If you want to take advantage of that, you can contact us, info@fipp.com, and we will tell you exactly how you can activate your free PressReader membership. Our next session is in 15 minutes at 4:30. We'll be talking to Monetizer. Nick will be back next Wednesday to help us wrap up the entirety of the Congress. So that means he's got to go back and watch all the sessions all over again just to make sure he knows what he's talking about. But in the meantime, Nikolay, thank you very much for a fascinating session. Thank you to everybody for watching, and we will see you all very soon. Goodbye.
Thanks, James.